You know, most of you, if not all of you, know that today is a special day. For one, because the Spring Seminar is taking place, and for other, because the biggest official visit in the history of Austria is coming to an end today. It started on the 7th of April to Beijing and is lasting until today. And apart from trying to making business in the context of the next Olympic Winter Games in China, the Belt and Road Initiative is one big hot topic to be discussed. So what is the Belt and Road Initiative about? It was announced by President Xi Jinping in the year 2013, and it is a big infrastructure investment project stretching throughout Eurasia when it comes to the economic belt and also to Africa in the context of the maritime Silk Road. And if you look at this map here, where I'm plotting when members joined the newly established Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, then you might also get the sense that it might develop to even a global investment strategy, with the main topics in infrastructure investment in transport, energy, information and communications technology. But we also think the geographical focus of this Belt and Road Initiative is in Asia for now, when you look at the projects that are ongoing and also at the volumes of the project, particularly in the western neighborhood of China. But we also think that it is one crucial instrument how China is now reaching out to Central East and Southeast Europe. So looking at the relationship between China and Europe, we know that China is the second biggest trading partner of the European Union, and the European Union is China's most important trading partner with trade flows of 1 billion euros per day. This is not something new, but I would like to point out 3 different events where we think that they are potentially shaping future relationships between China and Europe. One is the third Central Eastern Europe China Summit in 2014, where the 16+1 initiative was established. So 1 stands for China, and the 16 split up into 11 EU members, from the Baltics to Poland, the neighbors of Austria, and the newest member states, if you want to say so, for Croatia, Bulgaria, and Romania, and Western Balkan states. However, there are only 5 left if you have 11 plus 5, and there are 6 Western Balkan states, so Kosovo is not officially in the 16+1 initiative included, but wherever there's data available, we also include Kosovo in our analysis. So we, for our analysis, so far focus on these 16 countries of the 16+1 initiative. A second event is that already in 2009, COSCO, that is the China Ocean Shipping Company, was buying a 35-year concession for the biggest Greek harbor in Piraeus. And in the year 2016, it acquired 67% of the share of the harbor for 370 million euros. So when it comes to our region, the interest in our region, if you look at the red dot which should point to Piraeus, then somehow it would be logical if the focus of the Belt and Road Initiative is infrastructure investment, transport infrastructure in particular, that the focus will be on the Western Balkans to connect the harbor of Piraeus to the most important markets in Western Europe for China. And the last year 2017, also pointed out that these Chinese investments might also lead to intra-EU disputes. So one of the publicly best known initiatives in this Belt and Road Initiative is the railway from Budapest to Belgrade. And as we know, by last year, there are EU public procurement procedures that in this case Hungary did not adhere to, which obviously leads to these disputes, and this public tender was put out during the 6th CEE China Summit that took place in November last year. So we know that China has an interest in Central East and Southeast Europe, and now the question is why. And the first 2 points are more or less specific to Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans in particular. That is, with reduction in transport costs and transport time, it might better serve the EU market, particularly in Western Europe. And it might be a possibility if they engage in Central Eastern, in particular Southern Europe, to circumvent EU routes, to easier get access, and also to circumvent maybe some non-tariff measures or other trade barriers apart from tariffs. The other 3 points that I've listed here are not very particular to the Western Balkans. So we know that the interest of China when they look at transport and energy infrastructure investments is also to reduce the excess capacities that have built up over the last recent years in China, and very well known also from the media is the steel industry with Donald Trump, but also the European Union frequently putting forth anti-dumping investigations against China, but also vice versa, by the way. Another point is that with these infrastructure investments and these overcapacities that they have, it is a possibility to export Chinese unemployment, because we know from case studies that there are quite many projects that involve Chinese firms, Chinese workers. So this is also a way to do labor policy in a sense. And if not only Chinese companies and workers are employed for the implementation of these projects, but also local workers and companies, then they don't only gain access to new markets, but they might also develop new markets. Because so far, when you look at trade between the European Union and China, the focus is on Western Europe, whereas Southern and Eastern Europe might still develop to an important market for Chinese exports. So given these motives of China, what they all have in common is that if China wants to invest somewhere, there needs to be the need for these investments. So what I'm now going to do is to look at the infrastructure investment needs in the different countries, and then to look at which plans are there for infrastructure investments and whether they fit to the needs in the countries. And finally, I'm going to show some results from our institute, but also from other authors. So that's the agenda for now. Starting off with the needs. This is, here I've plotted data from the EBRD transition report, and I distinguish between the EU member states in the region and the Western Balkan states, and I've ranked them according to their infrastructure investment needs. And these are quite substantial. If you look at this graph, it is expressed as the annual investment needs in percent of GDP. So you see that for Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, for example, the EBRD says that there are infrastructure investment needs of more than 10% of GDP per year. They are much lower, going down to about 2% for the Czech Republic, but for the Western Balkan countries, they are through at above 8% per annum. Also, what I would like to highlight here is we've got 3 different colors, and the most prominent one is blue, which is the transport sector. Throughout my presentation, I'm going to keep the order of these countries like that, so that from the left to the right, you always see these are those, to the left, there are the countries with the highest need for infrastructure investment, and then it decreases. And the same for the Western Balkans. So now let's look at the state of the infrastructure in these countries. What we would expect is that now it reverses, that we've got upward trends here. Actually, we do see that levels are pretty low, except for 3 exceptions, that is Slovenia, Croatia, and Hungary, where they are quite comparable to the Western European peers. I just took, for comparison purposes, Italy, Germany, and Austria. All others show quite low levels, and what maybe is also worth highlighting is that for Latvia and Montenegro, these low motorways are absent altogether. So these are now motorways densities per land area, and it doesn't really matter. So it slightly differs, particularly the spike for Slovenia decreases a bit if you also account for population density. The trend is much clearer if you look at the railway network. So here is actually the picture that which we would expect, that with decreasing needs in infrastructure investment, you see a better state of the infrastructure in place. And what one sees immediately that actually the neighbors of Austria are quite in good shape and comparable to Austria, which can partly be traced back to the railway expansion in the 19th century. But when it comes, so all this railway density only looks at main railway lines. what is common to all the region is that high-speed rail lines are absent altogether. So this is still an infrastructure for a shortcoming that is not depicted in this picture here. So this was the first area where China is investing, transport. The second one is energy. And for this, we've plotted the electricity lines, or the density of electricity lines per 1,000 square kilometers. And what we do find here is that, again, for the neighborhood of Austria, they are comparable to Austrian levels. For the Western Balkans, it's quite lower, but for the Baltics, to the left, you see Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. By the way, on your handout on the very last page from my presentation, you also find the shortcuts of the country names if you're at some point maybe confused. So here for Estonia, EE, Latvia, and Lithuania, you find that these powerful electricity lines actually are absent altogether. They do have, obviously, electricity lines, but much less powerful grids. And finally, we've got information and communication technology. And to illustrate that, we looked at the percentage of households who have internet access at home, the year 2015. And what you do see here is that there is no decreasing or increasing. You see that with the exceptions of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania, all these countries have comparable percentages as their Western European peers, which we argue has also to do with the fact that information and communications technology to implement is less capital intensive than in transport infrastructure or energy infrastructure. So now we want to contrast these needs with the actual investments that are announced by China. Looking at the period 2007 to 2017, we do find that there are construction contracts of about 12 billion euros. And we do also find that 2/3 of these projects, both in terms of number of projects as well as volume, were initiated after 2013, so after the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we think that the announcement gave rise to a speeding up of these infrastructure projects. Geographically, we find that they are more concentrated in the central southern part of the region. So the first big pie of the chart is Serbia, and the third one is Hungary, which again is this rail link between Budapest and Belgrade. But there's also Bosnia and Herzegovina and Romania that are sticking out. And when it comes to the sectors, it seems that it's 50-50 between the energy and the transport sector, and all other sectors are more or less negligible. What is important to highlight here is that for most of these construction projects, it's about loans. So at some point, these countries have got to pay back. Now, we wanted to contrast that with grants that are given by the European Union, and we do find that for a 6-year period, we find about 11 or actually 12 billion euros, so very much comparable, but in grants, which do not pose this danger of debt unsustainability because they actually don't have to be paid back. What you do find here is just the EU members of the European Union, because for the Western Balkans, they have much limited access to these grants. What you find here is that mainly the biggest countries are targeted, and also the poorest, with Romania and Bulgaria, but the big bunch goes to Poland with a share of 60%. Unfortunately for this, we are not able to distinguish the data between transport and the energy sector. We just know that about 80% of all these investments are in either transport or energy. But we also wanted to compare the relative importance of the loans and the grants for the different regions. And what we find here is that for the European Union members of the region, the EU grants more or less dwarf all the loans that you get both from the European Union but also from China, with the one exception of Hungary, where you see one big gray bar here. But for the Western Balkans, the loans rule, so to say. So there are only very small blue bars where the countries have access to EU grants, and for the others, it's loans. For Albania, it's more or less all EU loans. We do see that for Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and for Serbia, the share of Chinese loans resulting from these construction projects are above 50%. So for the Western Balkans, these investments are really substantial. So when we take these numbers from these investments, we can try to come up with calculations of what the effects are. And we first started off with what could be short-term effects. And we thought about trade links. One is, for example, if there are investments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there might be an increased demand for Czech products, right? But there are also indirect import effects. So, for example, if Germany exports to Bosnia and Herzegovina for these infrastructure projects, there might still be Czech products in the German products that go to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we've got these import-output tables to calculate the overall effects. And what you do find here, and what I've plotted here, is the percentage change, well, the effect expressed in GDP, which is highest for Bosnia and Herzegovina and for Montenegro with above 10% of GDP. And lowest for the Western European parts. So if we take average, we find that for the EU members, the effect just through trade linkages are 0.4% for the EU members, but 6.6% for the Western Balkan states. So here the effects are much more substantial. Within the European Union, you do see that Hungary, due to the rail link, is the darkest country here, and it amounts to slightly above 1% of GDP. But apart from these short-term effects resulting from the trade links or the increased demand for products, we are also thinking about medium to long-term effects. And colleagues of mine were doing a study in 2015 where they looked at the Berlin process. The Berlin process is the EU initiative of infrastructure investment in the Western Balkans. And they came up with numbers saying that for a comprehensive transport infrastructure investment package of 7.7 billion euros in the Western Balkans that materialized or realized over a period of 15 years, this could lead to an increase in annual growth of 1 percentage point. Annual growth 1 percentage point, and could create 200,000 new jobs. And obviously, it's not only the Western Balkan countries or the CEE that profit from this increase in incomes, but also, for example, the net exporters like Austria that export to the region that have indirect effects. Also, one of the main motivations for China is to reduce these transport costs and transport times. And just in January this year, there was a study for the TRAN committee that showed that with the decrease in transport time, there will be a shift from air transport to rail transport. Whereas with the decrease in transport costs, there will be a shift from maritime trade to rail trade. And what they find in their analysis that 2.5 million containers will shift from the maritime to the rail, and 500,000 containers from air transport to rail. So put it more plastically, for 2040 they say that 50 to 60 additional trains per day are gonna depart and go to China, between China and the European Union. 50 to 60 trains per day, additional. Yeah. And with this reduction in transport costs and time, we also expect a diversification of exports and imports, not only in the products that are traded, but also given that the costs are lower for trading, there might also be a diversification in companies that actually engage in international trade, because previously it's not been profitable enough to do engage in international trade. And finally, with improved, especially transport infrastructure, we would hope that this gives, well, that pushes a bit for intra-regional cooperation. Obviously, that's not a necessary condition, it's not a sufficient condition, but we think it's a good basis to push towards more regional cooperation. So overall, the picture looks quite nicely with our positive effects of the Belt and Road Initiative, but there's always a but. And the but is that there is risk and uncertainty. There are some crucial questions that we still need to answer whether really these positive effects can materialize. One paper that was published just last month, yeah, it was published in March, looks at the debt sustainability or unsustainability of these infrastructure projects. They find significant risk for Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania, but more importantly, for Montenegro. So out of 65 countries that they looked at, They identified 8 countries of high risk, and one of them is Montenegro, and they link it only to one project, that is the linkage of the Port of Bar with Serbia. It is going to be realized in 3 phases, and the first phase costs 1.1 billion euros. And it is financed by the China Exim Bank, at least to 85%. And the IMF already said for the second phase and for the third phase, it is super important that there are highly concessional funds, otherwise there's high risk of debt default for Montenegro. A second point of concern is corruption. There is the paper that I've mentioned here is published by the European Institute for Security Studies, and it looked at 2 highway projects, and they found that, well, there was a big scandal, a big corruption scandal with direct payments both to politicians but also of subcontractors being very close to the National Party. And the attitude of China of investigating more into state-to-state relationships somehow fuels the fear of an increased corruption. Also, the rise of populist parties in more recent times who are explicitly looking for alternatives to the European way of modernizing administration and the economy also increases this risk. And with the financial dependency of a country, there might also be political dependency, which the European Union definitely doesn't want. So when it comes to European Union investigations against dumping of China, then there is a fear that some countries that are highly dependent on financing by China are then voting against putting an investigation to the WTO. And for me, the most crucial question is whether local companies are going to be involved, whether it's local suppliers, materials, and workers that will also be part of the implementation of these projects, because this is actually where the biggest gain can come from for the region. So yes, we do observe that China is reaching out to Central and Eastern Europe. We do see that there is a high need for infrastructure investments, and it seems that Chinese investments quite nicely fit to these infrastructure needs, and we do think that there is a potential for a win-win situation if they are implemented in a sustainable way. Thank you very much.